Welcome back to Tech Stack for all you tech enthusiasts. In this video, we're going to cover Angular services. Services play a very important role, especially in large projects. They help us share data across multiple components in a clean and efficient way. Whenever we want to achieve reusability and avoid code duplication, services are the solution. Instead of writing the same logic again and again in different components, we move that common logic into a service. A service is simply a TypeScript class. Typically, we keep our API calls inside services, along with utility logic like data transformation or filtering. We can also store data in service variables and access that data across different components throughout the application. Now, let's implement a service in our Angular application. First, create a new folder called Services. Now, open the integrated terminal inside the Services folder and create a new service called To Do. This command creates two files, one service file and one testing file. Now, open the To-Do service file. This is a simple TypeScript class, which is the basic structure of an Angular service. At the top, you'll see a decorator that marks this class as a service. This decorator tells Angular that this service can be injected anywhere in the application. Since it's provided at the root level, Angular creates a single instance and shares it across the entire app. Don't worry if decorators feel unclear right now. We'll cover decorators in detail in the upcoming videos. Services can also store data in variables, allowing multiple components to access and share the same data across the application. We can create functions inside the service to handle API calls, which is one of the main ways services are used in Angular. Services can also be used to create subjects or behavior subjects, which help share data reactively across multiple components. Services are also useful for storing functions, like utility or helper functions, so they can be reused across different components. All of these tasks, API calls, storing shared data, and utility functions, can be handled inside a service. Now, let's create a basic function called ConcatStrings inside the service. We've created a ConcatStrings function that takes two strings as input. Inside the function, we combine the two strings with a space in between and store the result in a variable called res. Finally, we return the residential variable, so the combined string can be used wherever the function is called. Now, imagine your project requires concatenating strings in multiple components. Instead of writing the same logic in every component, we put it in a common place, a service, so it can be reused across the application. Open the integrated terminal in the Pages folder and create a new component called Service Test. Now, open approutes.ts and add a route for the service test component. Before moving ahead, as you know, Angular recently released Angular 21. We are covering Angular 21 from scratch, so if you're a beginner or intermediate, this series will be highly recommended for you. We have also provided the Angular 21 playlist in the description for easy access. Open app.html and add a link for the service test component in the navigation bar. Open the terminal and run ng serve to check that the service test component is working. As you can see, the service test component is working perfectly. Open the service test component and add a constructor. Now, we want to use the ConcatStrings function from our service in this component. In Angular, there are two ways to inject a service into a component. The first way is to inject the service directly inside the constructor by adding it as a private parameter. This is the first way private to-do service to do. Now, use the service function by calling todoservice.concatStrings and pass in two strings, like Angular and tutorials, storing the result in a variable called res. For testing, add a debugger here so you can inspect the result in the browser. Next, go to the ConcatStrings function in the to-do service and add a debugger inside the function as well. Now, let's test the service and see the function in action. You can see the debugger inside the ConcatStrings function. It receives the two parameters with the values Angular and tutorials. The function combines the two parameters, stores the result in res, and then returns that value. You can see the return value from the ConcatStrings function here in the constructor. Now, we'll use the same ConcatStrings service function in the getAPI component. This will help you understand how functions and services can be reused across multiple components. This time, we'll use the other way to inject a service in Angular. Instead of the constructor, we can assign the service using to-do service is equal to inject to-do. Here, you pass the to-do service class name to the inject function to get an instance of the service. Now, call the service to-do service function ConcatStrings in the constructor. We can use the same service function in other components as well. This demonstrates the reusability of functions when placed inside a service. We're currently using the API call directly. To make our code more reusable, we'll move this API call into the to-do service. We'll create a function called getTodos inside the service that fetches the data using HTTP client and returns the result. To perform the API call inside the service, we need an instance of HTTP client. HTTP client is a built-in service provided by Angular to make HTTP requests. Now, in the service, create a function called getTodos. Inside this function, we'll make the API call using HTTP client, and whatever data we receive, we'll return it so that any component can use it. Now, let's create the API call inside the getTodos function in the service using HTTP client. Copy the API URL and pass it as a parameter to the get method inside the getTodos function. You can see that the get method returns an observable. Whenever a function returns an observable in Angular, we use subscribe to access the data. Now, in the component, call todoservice.getTodos and use subscribe to handle the API response. Inside the subscribe method, we get the API response in the next callback, which receives the result. Now, store the API response in the to-do list variable by assigning it. Now, remove the direct API call from the component, since we're handling it inside the service. For testing, add a debugger in the subscribe callback, so you can inspect the API response in the browser. Now, let's test the API integration using the service and see if everything works as expected. You can see that we receive 200 records from the API in the result variable, and we assign this data to to-do list to use in the component. We can also create reactive forms in a service. This allows us to share the form and its data across multiple components. Now, create a variable in the service called course, set its type to string, and assign it the value React. We can use this variable in multiple components. By creating variables in a service, we can make them available globally across the application. In the next video, we'll cover post-API integration in Angular. If you're passionate about learning new technologies, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Tech Stack, and keep learning new skills. Thank you. And remember, consistency is the key to success.